a really long time ago, and we didn't really meet face to face for a long time after that.
Yes.
I think we probably didn't meet for 8 years other than that. But in this setup, we met very quickly, and I asked for some help a long time ago. And Jen offered some of her time. As I said earlier, Jen is an activist. She is the CEO of a company called Cool World, which does cooperative marketing. And she is a technical person, but she also helps people who are homeless, helps people who are foodless, and helps people who have no money. And we're here today, and she's going to talk a little bit about that's Jen right there. A little bit about universal basic income. I give universal basic income the 3 Ps: potential, polarizing, and preeminent.
Love it.
So Jen, I'm going to pass this over to you. You're in good hands in this room. Let me know how we can help. We'll go from there.
Thanks so much, Rob. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this today. It's a very timely moment for those of you who are in Ontario. We're in the middle of a very interesting set of election conversations around things like basic income. So we're also kind of at a pivotal point in terms of pilots around the world, how those are panning out, the data that's being generated, and major shifts in the workforce that are really driving this. But let's start sort of with some fundamental principles. How many of you are familiar with basic income? What do you think about when you hear the words basic income? As Rob said, it can be very polarizing. So let's talk about what it is first and what it isn't. And I'd love to hear from the group about any early perceptions they have about what a basic income might be.
I think really hard about the eventuality of where a lot of corporate life and where we generate our revenues and income. And I just, for me, Jennifer, I see it as the eventual solution. I can't get out of the box that goes down the road that at some point in time, we need to provide at least a threshold for people to make a subsistence. I may be a little bit more negative about the future employment prospects for people and how they can make income. So that's my point of view.
Sorry, I just had to get somebody to turn off a dustbuster in the background.
Turn off that dustbuster.
So yes, Sean, I think you're absolutely right. There's an inevitability to this just based on the way that the workforce is shifting. And I think we saw some of that, in fact, maybe a cautionary tale when we saw the convoy rolling into Ottawa. Big argument there for automated vehicles. For lots of reasons, people who don't want their vehicles, their property involved in those types of activities are going to be investing heavily in automation and in much of what Elon Musk is trying to accomplish right now. So the implications of that, imagine that all of a sudden we have a fleet worldwide of automated trucks and we have a workforce that is no longer employed. In Canada, there are over 250,000 truck drivers. And it's not obviously just truck driving that could be impacted. Everything from the legal profession to things like marketing, which is something that I've spent a lot of my career in, could potentially be impacted. So, over the next 50 years, the prediction is that large segments of the workforce are going to have their jobs essentially automated. So then what do we do at that point? We have people with a tremendous amount of leisure time who will not have any income. And that is typically not a great social outcome. So what are the options that are in place and what actually can be done? Any thoughts on sort of that shift? Are you noticing that in your workplaces, in the trends that you're seeing out there in the workforce in general? Love to hear about any changes that you're seeing, jobs that are becoming obsolete faster perhaps than expected, and or are changing in ways that are going to make it more difficult for people to actually learn and earn an income doing them.
Well, I know one thing that jumps into my head, Jen, is right away, with the pandemic and the shutdown of all the face-to-face activities, the restaurants all closed, all those people didn't have jobs to go to.
Exactly.
And what would happen? And it was a shock. And what could you do? The mystery and I guess the uncertainty. And the way I see the way the government programs, that was almost like a trial run of what you do when you're in a shock. So this was a pandemic and we had to close down things. Well, an industry can close down.
Exactly.
And it certainly has happened, and we haven't melted yet.
Not yet.
Like some of my friends consider, like, if you deliver this, that's it. That's the end of the world. No one will work. They'll just sit around.
Yes. That's the great terrifying fear. And I mean, for any of us who have been in a position where we've worked with people who have low income or live in poverty, you know that that's not the case. Work is a part of who we are as human beings. All of us want to be able to be productive. Reality is that for lots of reasons, some of us cannot be productive. But the number of people who actually just want to sit back and do nothing and take home some money, there's always going to be a segment of the population that's going to be the case for, just like there's always going to be a segment of the population that's going to operate with programs like this fraudulently. But that's a very small percentage considering the number of people who it could benefit. And it certainly is not a reason not to do it, although that is one of the stronger arguments against it. And certainly what we saw during the beginning stages of the pandemic, when CERB was introduced, was basically a type of basic income for folks who are not going to be able to work because of pandemic related reasons. And so there's some interesting learnings from CERB on all kinds of sides. But I kind of want to talk for a minute about one of the more urgent drivers of this overall. And I'm going to scan back a bit to the shirt that I'm wearing, which says, maybe you can read that for me, Rob. Can you read it? Sorry, I'm testing.
Can you live on $1,169 a month?
Exactly. So anybody know what $1,169 a month represents in Ontario?
A bad day at the racetrack?
If you are
the average amount of cost that you have to live on. I don't know. Oh, I'm already wrong, Jenna.
You're really close, Sean. If you are on disability in Ontario, the maximum amount that you can receive as a single person is $1,169 a month.
Wow.
So when you think about that, that includes you have to pay for your rent, your food, your medication that may not be covered by the province. That is not a livable amount of money. And as Rob mentioned at the beginning of this, I do a lot of fundraising. I do fundraising every single day, as a matter of fact, for families that are living on ODSP, who are typically between $700 and $800 short every month of basic living expenses like groceries. So obviously this is an untenable position. There are close to 500,000 people across the province who are living on this and are living in a state of what is not only poverty, but a state the United Nations calls deep impact poverty, which is about $3,000. The current ODSP rate is about $3,000, what the UN considers deep impact poverty. So in Canada, we have people who are disabled as a result of an injury, as a result of something they were born with, who are forced into legislated poverty. And the consequences of this are absolutely dire. People are dying on the streets in wheelchairs. So this is the first kind of rationale for a basic income for folks who are, first of all, may not have the either physical or intellectual ability to work and take care of themselves. The way that this has been dealt with in the past is to essentially punish people who are on benefits, which has resulted in a class of abject poverty. And so this is one of the reasons why basic income is considered the future for people who are in these situations. The poverty rate in Canada at the moment is considered to be about $2,200 a month. So you can see that people who are living on ODSP are getting about half of that.
Jen, could you mention something about the clawbacks that are in place in this legislation as well?
Absolutely. The clawbacks are horrific. So if you are on ODSP and you are married to someone who has an income above a certain threshold, you will no longer receive ODSP, which means that you are completely dependent on your spouse financially, everything. If you're physically disabled, then you're even more dependent on that person. That can create a very, very pressure driven situation. It removes people's autonomy. It can often develop into abuse in the relationship. So that's just one example of a clawback. Other clawbacks are things like there may be something that's on the drug registry right now, but they decide they're going to take it off. You have received money for that. They will claw that back off of your income later on. If you receive federal disability, CPP, they will claw the entire thing back. It's about $900 a month. So the Ontario government right now will take that all away from you, which means that instead of being able to live on your benefit, which in every other country is a legally entitled benefit that cannot be taken away, Ontario treats it like income. And that has had dire consequences for people on disability across the entire province and really across the country, because this is not any different anywhere else. I think the maximum that anyone is getting across Canada right now is $1,300. And the best province, frankly, if you are a disabled person to live in right now is PEI, which coincidentally is in the process of doing a basic income pilot as well. So I thought then next we could talk about a little bit about, sorry, let me just stop for a second, see if there's any questions on that first. Any questions on clawbacks, ODSP, sort of the rationale for why this is important?
The other, one of the ones I'm going to add into the clawback is that if you want to work, but maybe you've got a disability, but you can only work part-time, say 4 hours a week or 10 hours a week, which is you want to work, well, they'll claw back the money. So the government gives you the decision, well, if you don't even want to work part-time, so how does that help with your mental health? If you can work part-time and you could, but you get clawed back, it's just this loop that there's two different decision makers going on. There's a saver that is treating a part of our population badly, and a spender trying to spend the money to help people, and they're in a loop against each other, and no one knows the net.
Exactly. And the reality is too, the province is essentially trying to get ODS for itself, which is really not how these programs should work at all. And that comes at the cost of the people who are on the benefit. It means they can't live an independent life of dignity at all. And that's really, really challenging, especially when we look at what's happening in the pandemic era. Even things like minimum wage jobs, the clawback rate at anything is about 50%. So half of what you earn up to a certain point is going to be taken away. And then if you earn more than that, you will not be eligible for ODSP anymore. So there's all kinds of little things built into the system to try and retain as much of the money as they can. And as a result, you're seeing that the people are coming off the rolls. But more importantly, there's an entire program around assisted dying now that's kind of pushing people into. It's a kind of a bleak part of the conversation, which we can get into a little bit later if we want to. But I thought it would be interesting to transition to this at this point, unless there's any other questions about this, into some of the pilots that are out there and some of the successes, the models, and what those have looked like. Sound good?
Just one question, Jennifer. This could be a quick answer. I've seen universal basic income, which is what I know the term to be, or minimum income. Sorry, and then I've seen basic income too. Are there various definitions of this whole arena, or are they very similar to each other?
Thank you, Sean. That's a great question and a really great point. There are a number of definitions. The original basic income concept was something that would be received by every single person in a population. So, for example, every Canadian would receive $1,000 every month. And that's just a flat amount. And that was sort of the initial idea of what a basic income could be. Whether that was the amount or not is up for discussion. Now that has evolved, because when that was presented to people in poverty and people with disabilities, the concern was that every other benefit that they were getting, including things like pharmacare, would then be taken out of that. So then it became something called a guaranteed livable basic income. So what is that amount? And then that became indexed to things like inflation. And then there are variations on that, and some programs are for a certain income threshold. So if you're making more than $60,000, $70,000 a year, you will not be eligible for basic income. And the way that the sort of prototypical basic income program would have worked sorry, my phone rang there and I got a little distracted for a second. The original idea of the basic income was that anybody would get it, and then it would be taxed from people who were above a certain income threshold who didn't need it. And one of the reasons why that it was felt that that would be a good way to approach it was simplicity of administration, et cetera. It's more and more apparent that it's going to need to be more nuanced than that. And so there's a lot of variations around. There was really an interesting critique recently from a senator, and I'll post some of these links in the chat when this is over, of some of the limitations of basic income, which I didn't think was particularly well informed. But that's another reason why it's as controversial as it is as well, is because there's many different permutations and ways of people looking at it. Any other questions?
Hi there.
Yes.
Hi there. It's Maureen Gauchi. I'm in the Kingston area. I come at this issue from a criminal justice perspective. I'd like to, I can't count how many parole hearings I sit in on a daily basis where when we talk to recidivism and return to crime, you know, it's pointed to that, you know, they just simply can't afford not to continue either trafficking drugs or stealing, or so there's another cost to society in terms of you know, when we don't provide people with a basic income. You know, obviously cost of victimization, incarceration, societal costs. And so I just wanted to chime in on that point.
It's an excellent point, and I'm going to share an anecdote with you. I was outside of the Muslim Welfare Center last winter, cooking meals for some folks in the neighborhood, and we were leaving after, and there was a gentleman sitting outside of the building, just sitting on a bench, 2:00 in the afternoon. It was about -18, and he obviously didn't have anywhere to go. And I asked what had happened to him. He said he'd just gotten out of prison. He had nowhere to go, nowhere to sleep. He had no money. He didn't have the slightest clue what his next step was going to be. And so I ended up taking him to an encampment of homeless people in Trinity Bellwoods Park, because there was literally, there were no beds, there were no shelter beds, nothing available. So we're looking at an entire group of people who are emerging from prison sentences, who have nowhere to go, no income. And to your point, what's the option at that point? It's going back to what they did before. It's recidivism. So that alone is could be a hugely impactful factor that we haven't really seen in any of the pilot information that I've seen so far anyway. So thank you so much. I think it's a really, really important and good point. Thank you. So any other questions before I start talking about some of the pilots that we have underway or that we have seen? Canada is actually a pioneer in basic income. There was a experiment called Mincome in Manitoba in, I think it was the 70s and the 80s. And there's some really interesting data from that. It's quite a different form from some of the things that we're talking about, and I'll share some links on that in the chat as well. The most recent one, and I think the one that's the most interesting, is the one that was done, started by the Wynne government in Ontario, and then unfortunately canceled by Doug Ford once he took office. And this one worked. It was a $24,000 a year. Sorry, that's not correct. $18,000 a month for a single person. $18,000 a year for a single person, which is substantially above what they were earning before, and was in addition to any of their disability support payments or Ontario Works. And the data from this has been tremendous, both from a quality of life perspective, how much it has improved people's mental health, improved their physical health because their ability to buy better quality food, the lack of stress and fear from wondering how they're going to manage to put rent together every month. Huge contributor to mental health. Reported that homes and families were much more, had much less fractious, much better relationships. And the other really interesting outcome of this that is one of the really strong sort of economic benefits of the program is the economic stimulus that is provided to the community. So when people who don't have a lot of money get more money, what do? they're not going to put it in the bank. They're going to spend it because they need to. And so that supports local businesses. They can also afford to start putting some away, but it really does go back to the community in a very, very immediate way. And we saw that with CERB as well, that those funds went to landlords, went to food, and went into places that managed to keep a lot of those businesses alive. So when that came to an abrupt stop, the feedback from the participants was really kind of devastating. It was very, very, I've been reading a lot of accounts of people who were taken off the program and just how much it's impacted them and set them back financially, but also psychologically. So the data is so clear that this is a really powerful concept for parts of people in parts of our society that have really been neglected for a long time, but also for those who are going to need this as our future is changing when it comes to what employment is going to look like in the next little while. Apologies if you guys can hear, there's some drilling going on here apparently. So I'd like to maybe stop for a minute. Anybody else heard of or familiar with any other pilots, the benefits, and in particular the economic stimulus, which is a really important part of this?
I'd like to ask one question. And what you just said, out of curiosity, I'm assuming that there's been perhaps studies run comparing the cost of giving, in the example you gave, X amount of dollars that are going to be put back into the community versus giving funds from the government in some sort of entitlement program. Have they done a comparison of whether one's more expensive than the other? Did I make sense in that particular question? Can we hear me?
Can you just summarize that for me again? I'm so sorry.
I'm wondering, you made an interesting remark about people would begin putting money into their local communities, this money that they're giving as a basic
Yes.
income. Prior to any kind of basic income, I'm assuming, they may be getting health benefits. They may be getting food. There's other ways money comes to folks to support them, various programs. The cost of the basic income program versus the cost of these other entitlement and various programs, is there any kind of comparison in proportionality of those funds? How much they cost? I'm assuming it's cheaper actually to do a universal basic income than the other, but I don't know. So I'm just wondering about data.
Jen, I don't know if you got that question. Did you catch the question? It's about comparing UBI programs to entitled programs and what how the balance changes.
Sorry, guys. Sorry about that. Had some technical difficulties again here. I'm so sorry. So if I am going to, I'll restate what I think I heard you say. Are in place for basic income, for folks basic income, and what's the cost?
Breaking up.
Breaking up a little bit, Jen.
Oh, these work from home issues. Geez, the pandemic is still causing us to get to our knees here.
I am so sorry, guys. I don't know what's going on. It's sort of randomly moving from me to different devices here. Can you hear me now?
Question to another time if we need to, if it becomes intrusive in the flow.
So let me just try and restate what I think you were saying. There is a certain amount of income that people are getting now. What is the differential between that and what they would get on basic income? Is that kind of the gist of it?
Yeah, I would assume that not only is the benefit that it's at least equal in dollars spent, maybe even cheaper, but there's many other benefits too, as far as self-worth, as far as a healthier community, and so forth and so on. But I was just wondering if anybody who's data-driven and numbers hungry, like so many folks are, has done a comparison of what the dollars would be compared.
Right.
We don't have
So what's really interesting is there's been an analysis done, a very cursory one by an economist named Mike Moffat in Canada, that if we folded in all of the existing benefits, EI, the Canadian Child Benefit, welfare across the country, disability benefits across the country, any other sort of social program dollars, that we would be able to pay for a basic income for every single person in this country. Now, that may not scale to larger countries, but the basic math is there, that could replace just about everything. And it would be a more efficient spend in many ways as well. When you think about things like food banks, where you've got a tremendous amount of money being poured into a resource that is not really helping anyone in most cases. And you look at things like homelessness and housing initiatives, shelters, et cetera, for people who don't have anywhere to go, similar type of thing. We have been conducting anti-poverty initiatives in North America for 50 years. And what happens? The number of poor people in our society continues to increase. So something is not working here. And if we actually got together and looked at this from a holistic perspective, we could really change the way that our society operates, especially for the bottom 25th percentile.
And that was the gist of my question, that just on a dollars level, it's got to be comparable, and there's innumerable other societal benefits as well. So,
exactly. Exactly. The societal benefits are extensive. There's actually a really interesting basic income pilot being privately run in New York City right now for single mothers. I think 5,000 single mothers are getting $1,000 a month for the next 3 years from a private donor, just to see, what does that change about the quality of their life, their children's lives. And they're going to be tracking that for about 20 years just to see what the impact is. So very interesting permutations of this all over the place.
thank you.
Sorry it took me so long to get that answer to you. Any other questions about funding or the pilots at all? No?
Have you seen any programs, Jen, that are specifically at a demographic, either for older people or for younger people?
No, I've seen them for people in certain situations, and versus demographic based. I think because the general idea is that people would be able to receive the benefit, ideally regardless of their demographics, unless there's some major life development, like for the single mother pilot that's happening in New York City. So I think it really can depend on getting into a large enough segment of society that the results are meaningful, but not making it so small that it's hard to apply the data that is generated. And that's really the state that we're in right now is data gathering still. The Ontario Liberals have committed to restarting the pilot, which is a bit of a shame because it would be fantastic if they would have expanded it rather than just leaving it at the level that it's at right now. But that is where we're at.
Have you heard of any government departments in any country looking at the adjustment or the result of the CERB payments that went directly to people? And I'm curious, like, did they go back to work? What did they do with that money? Did they go back to school? What was is there a possibility, or have you heard about a study or studies that are going on anywhere about that? Because it could be a fantastic natural experiment to observe what happened.
From most of what we understand, and there are some studies being done. I haven't seen any results yet, but most people did not go back to work. A lot of people ended up either pursuing things that they were interested in their leisure life, a lot of volunteering, and a lot of people just sat on the money. Those were sort of the three major scenarios that we heard of. I believe that there is data going to be coming out of the government. There was also some sort of controversial stuff, especially out of the West Coast. Some of you may have heard that the Premier of BC was blaming CERB on high drug overdose rates, which, is another another way of trying to make it look like it's a less viable option than it is, when the reality is that that issue and that addiction is going to be there regardless. How they get money to feed it is a different matter. So there is going to be some data at some point produced about it. I'm not sure it's going to be produced from a basic income angle, though.
Jen, hi, sorry, it's Denise here. And
Hey, Denise.
Hi. And I love hearing about this because I've had a discussion with my friend who is he's an economist about this.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I'm hearing, because we're talking about pilots, and the questions that I'm hearing are a lot about what have the studies shown. So, and maybe I missed this, but the idea of universal basic income, it sounds it's new, right? The way we're talking about the incarnation of it now. And is that why there's like not enough study done, or is there just not enough resources put into longitudinal studies? I'm just trying to understand the concept.
Such a great question. So I would say really up until 2015, it was a fringe issue. My brother actually is a columnist. He writes for TechCrunch, and he wrote a number of columns in 2013 and 2014 about basic income. And at that point, people were like, well, that'll never happen. That's just a pipe dream. But then sort of the shifting job market reality started to become more clear. You started to see, because of financial deregulation, that people who are in some of the lower income brackets, and people in particular who are on minimum wage, were just not able to make it as successfully as they were. And so that is really, along with the crisis of people who are on benefits. And I think the other piece that's really driving this is the anticipated increase in folks who are going to have disabilities across Canada and across the world, partly as a result of COVID. It's projected that we're going to have just as many disabled people with long COVID as there are disabled people on ODSP in the province right now, period. So when you think of that, that's a doubling of the funding that's going to be needed for those benefits. So I think there's a lot of thinking about, what are the societal needs going to look like over the next 20 to 30 years. As the population ages, that also changes how disability can come into play too. And the other piece of this that I think is really interesting is the amount of care that is going to be required for people who are aging and people who have disabilities. Currently a massively underfunded sector that is going to experience a tremendous amount of growth. And the basic income is seen potentially as the way to fund that, whether it's taking care of somebody at home, whether it's done as part of your employment, so that we have the ability to take care of what is looking like a looming care crisis as well. I don't know if that answered the question, but
it does, Jen. So I was just trying to understand the problem, but it's so big. And I understand that the pandemic has probably been a catalyst to uncover some of what underlying issues have already been there, right? So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, not even just underlying issues, but you've probably seen the headlines. We have grocery CEOs whose take-home pay has doubled or tripled during the pandemic. We have chains, grocery chains the profits are just soaring, while we have 50% of the country, from an Angus Reid poll done this week, that isn't sure how they're putting food on the table for their families anymore. So either there's a massive amount of increased regulation and a huge, profound change to our tax policy, or we have to do something like this, or we're going to leave millions of people behind.
Love that, Jen, because so far a lot of what I hear about is it's a public sector solution. But what you've just mentioned when you're talking about the grocery chains is that there's something that can be done. Private sector has responsibility to improve this for everyone. So I guess what I'm saying is there isn't only a government solution to this problem in terms of universal basic wage, right? And it's maybe not just increasing the minimum wage, right? There's this discrepancy between the highest paid worker in an organization and the lowest paid worker in the organization. And it's a multiple, it's an order of magnitude difference, where I don't think that was the case even 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. Right?
So the shift there has been really quite astronomical. Yeah.
Okay.
And,
you
know, what we're really talking about doing here is establishing a floor, right? We don't have a floor right now. It is perfectly acceptable for us to say people should live on $537 housing allowance and $400 in living expenses in Ontario right now every month. That is, nobody can live on that. And so I was out this morning working with a 6-month pregnant woman who's panhandling at the corner of Spadina and Queens Quay so that she has somewhere to sleep at night. That is not acceptable. That is what our society has come to right now. We need to establish that it is not okay for anybody in this country to survive. It's impossible for anyone in this country to survive on less than $2,200 a month. And that's not including the recent explosion in inflation. So if this does nothing other than set a standard for what we are going to say as a society, this is what we're going to allow people to live on, then at least that's accomplished something. Because as I said, you know, in every single province of this country, people on disabilities aren't living on more than $1,200 or $1,300 a month, which doesn't even cover rent. So this is not just a financial question. This is not just a social question. This is a moral question, especially when we have, as we saw today, if you read the Globe and Mail, executives in the wealth management industry who are tripling their income and taking home $6 million a year. I said publicly on Twitter today, I think we do 90% marginal tax rate now. I know probably nobody on this on this discussion is going to agree with me on that. But we're getting to the point where something like that is going to be necessary just because of the extent to which the deregulation has gone.
Can I drop in some kind of a question, Jen?
Absolutely, please do.
This has nothing to do, so it's probably, this is like the first one. Do you know Sultan Itzvan's? He's running for president in the United States with the Transhumanist Party. He's kind of a libertarian. Do you know he wants to like tax the federal land in order to UBI to run? Do you know that?
I didn't, but I think we're going to see more and more of that. And it's certainly something that I applaud. The more politicians who stand up for something like this, the more mainstream it becomes and the better it is for the people who really need it.
And the second one, probably, and here from down south, do you think that Latin America and developing countries can catch up to the fact of having some UEI to us? Because
yes, absolutely.
Like,
sorry.
I live in Uruguay, but my expenses are if I was living in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, right now, probably. So like I pay like the same, and dude, it's like, you know, you have to try to catch on that like all the currency, inflation, deflation, you know, crypto, whatever. It's like something's gotta give at certain point for sure, because we are being like.
Yes. So I've got two comments on that. The first is that we did some research recently just about what programs look like in Africa. There's actually a $600 a month minimum basic income in Namibia if you're on disability, which is a higher percentage than you would get if you are here in Canada. So there are, you know, small little pockets of this happening all over the world. They're just not consistent geographically. So there may actually be a couple of pilots in your part of the world as well, or even fully fledged programs. And I'm going to drop a link into the chat as well with a summary of all of the known income pilots, but this is something that changes every day, and it's something you can check back on regularly as well. The other point I wanted to make is one of the oldest and most advanced, although they don't call it a basic income program, is shockingly in Alaska. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Sovereign Fund in Alaska, but it generates a certain amount of money for every resident of Alaska every year, ranging from $500 to, I think at one point it got as high as $2,000. And that's that's not even really talked about. Partly, I think, because the United States, this is not really a concept that would work well with their individualist approach and low tax approach and low small government approach. But it's worked there, and it's worked there for a really long time, and it's had the impact of nearly eradicating poverty in Alaska as well. Any other questions? So I'm going to paint two scenarios for you now. One is where we have a fully funded basic income for every single person in Canada at a level of $2,200 a month. And for those who do not need it, let's say at above $70,000 or $80,000, whatever the number is that's decided, that money just comes off automatically as tax and goes back into the government. Anybody on the phone in favor of that kind of a model, and why or why not?
What's the impact on other entitlement programs?
All of the other entitlement programs would be folded into this, but it would also create space for low-income pharmacare, the existing childcare programs, et cetera, would all be part of this as well.
Okay, I vote yay. Is 2,200 enough?
It is right now. It would be indexed, so it'd be indexed to inflation. So, for example, in the Ontario election, the NDP has committed to doubling the ODSP rates to 2,300 and then indexing them, which would put them at 2,500 should they be elected.
Does that coincide with an increase in the minimum wage?
That has not been on the table. Interestingly enough, the minimum wage has been discussed, but there's been much more focus on ODSP, I think, just because the rates are so low that people are choosing medically assisted dying instead of continuing to go on because they literally cannot afford to live. So,
and my thought there is that if you have basic income, if you increase the minimum wage, that's an incentive to go work. They won't make more money, or choose the other path, or accept the other path. That's just a better way of putting it.
The other option is that we look at the million people in Canada who have the lowest incomes, calculate what they would need to lift them out of poverty, and then provide that to them. And then as they do move out of poverty or shift in and out, then the amounts change. Any thoughts on that as a solution?
One more time on that, Jen. You caught me fresh on that one. I might be
Sure.
Speaking on behalf of the audience.
Really just for low-income folks. So the million people in Canada, there's about 3 million people in Canada that live in poverty right now. So tackling the million who are living in the deepest poverty initially, and then expanding the program over time as the people who have the greatest need are taken care of.
What's the threshold for poverty?
The threshold right now is 22. Sorry, it's 2,000 officially, but it's actually 2,200. That's the poverty line in Canada.
How would that impact hospitalization care, free access to hospitals and medical care, subsidized prescription care? Because some parts of the population that are age-based, under 25 and over 65, I think, get free medication. So how would that impact that?
So that would continue with the guaranteed livable basic income. Meds would continue, excuse me, meds would continue to be covered. But you brought something up in the first part of that is, I think, really interesting.
Hospitalization specifically, because the government has been chipping away at what's covered.
Yes.
I remember since I was a little
gosh,
girl.
have they ever? Yeah. And actually, so what's interesting about the pilot was that it showed that there was a preventative aspect to the basic income as well. So people who were on the basic income did not get sick as often, did not require as much hospitalization. So that's something that really needs to be understood as well, but it would not in any way change the medical the health system entitlements that we have currently. That's got to be a non-starter, especially since we've got so many folks who are on disability who would be part of this, who do need that continued access and care.
Can I ask a question, Jennifer?
Yep.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. I'm bad at the 3-second awkward silences. I try to jump in sometimes. I know this can have a political lens to it. Yep. People on one side of the aisle like it. People on one side of the aisle don't. But you may have more insight into this, because my thought is that there is an argument to be said that this doesn't have to have a political stripe to it. That
you are absolutely right. Yeah.
Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I think sometimes we operate as a guild of kind of apolitical interest, but on this topic in particular, there is an argument for both sides to want to see progress on this front.
That's really insightful, Sean. You're absolutely right. There's a small government argument to be made here, and there's a big government argument to be made here. And they're essentially the same argument, ironically enough. One is that if we fold all of these existing social programs, EI, childcare benefit, et cetera, into something like this, then the admin required is so much smaller. The amount of things like food banks, shelters, all of these would essentially disappear if people have an income like this, which is a small government argument, but also negates the sort of traditional role of charity in the conservative mindset. So there, that appeals to a lot of people on the conservative side and frightens people who are waiting for the benefit to come, because they're like, okay, now all of the stuff that I really need is going to be stripped away, and it's just going to be this very basic program. I'm not going to get pharma, et cetera. So there's an appeal and a concern. And then the negative from the small government side is obviously just the cost that's going to be involved in something like that. And on the other side, I think kind of already highlighted the concerns that would be in place there, which are how much access are people going to have to services, what's going to be clawed back. This province does not have a great record with clawbacks in general. So people are very, very concerned about what the implications are going to be. There's a distinct lack of trust in anything that says it's going to be for basic income or for people in poverty. So there's a certain amount of bad faith that has to be overcome as well. And so, can we actually come up with a solution that's going to work for both sides? It's actually possible. It would take some pretty sophisticated design, but this is something that can both appeal and look like a nightmare to either side of the political spectrum. So I would consider it fairly apolitical, actually. What do you think, Sean?
Yeah, I think so too. I've seen experiences in Europe. I know, granted, Europe may have a different kind of, everything slants a little bit left overall, but I've seen arguments proposed on both sides of the fence for something along these lines, and yeah, some strong arguments. I mean, I don't know how many political parties I voted for in my lifetime, so I'm fairly non-aligned. This one appeals to my my sensibilities, and the fact that, really, I mean, you mentioned it off the top, and I wasn't fast enough to jump in, but if you look at transportation, over the next 20 years.
Yes.
You know, almost 10% of the employment of our world relies on transportation, truckers, drivers, whatever. All of a sudden, autonomous cars and things happen. And I know there's some arguments in terms of when that's happened, but I think it's clear some very smart companies are investing a lot of money in it. It's going that way. You know, if you're 60, I get it. If you're a 25-year-old truck driver, we can have programs that can retrain you, get you into different things. But if you're 65 and you still need to make some type of income, I don't see another way around doing something along the lines of UBI.
Exactly. And even if you look at a profession like law, 90% of what is done in the creation of court cases and, you know, the busy work is eventually going to be done by AI. There, obviously, you know, the hard calls, the interpretations, you're going to need very sophisticated legal skills for that. But there's a tremendous amount of grunt work in law that can be taken out, which, you know, what's the impact going to be on that profession? Accounting. Like, just think about where the technology is going and what kinds of roles are going to be eliminated in the not very distant future. And that presents us with a real crisis of what are people going to do with their time? Any other final? Got about 5 minutes left.
So we at the Guild, Jen, you've never spoken at one of our big events before, are very positive. We're very optimistic. Paint the picture for us in X years, give you a dozen years because that's the dozen we laid out before. It's long enough to make up some stuff. What is the golden picture here 12 years from now in Canada or in North America? Go ahead.
So I think in Canada, in, let's say, I think we're going to see something in the next 10 to 15 years, just because of population shifts, particularly around the aging population and the disabled population. I think we're going to see a basic income that's the poverty line, probably a little bit above, because the poverty line should be a floor, not a ceiling. So maybe looking at something, you know, between $2,000 and $3,000 a month in the next 10 years. I think it's possible that we will have up to, you know, 8 or 9 million people on UBI by, let's say, 2040. Just given what we're seeing from disability rates, they're already 25 people with disabilities are already 25% of the population in Canada. That's only going to increase, as we know, as the job trends shift. So, you know, I think we're going to see a lot of movement towards this with a tremendous amount of study. And I think somebody made a really, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the person's name, but the involvement of the private sector is something that we really have not talked about very much. This has been seen as a public sector responsibility to date. And so to see that there's a privately funded initiative taking place in New York City is potentially a way for, you know, rather than going the taxation, then apply the taxation route, maybe some of the companies in this country could actually start funding these initiatives directly. I can't even really think about what that would look like or how that would work right now. But a partnership could be very beneficial as long as it doesn't become exploitative on the part of an employer, which is something that we always have to be concerned about when these types of programs are in place. So that's the vision.
Great stuff. So I'll just read you this quote, fresh off the daily of Stats Canada. I quote, "In the midst of high job vacancies and historically low unemployment, Canada faces record retirements from an aging labor force. The number of seniors aged 65 and older grows 6 times faster than those 0 to 14. I think people should worry more about demographics when they write policy than worried about who doesn't have a job anymore because of automation, especially when we fix lousy jobs. There are a lot of jobs coming. We should think about that and build towards that.
Yep,
you're pay people at the bottom.
Yeah,
it's the way to stay rich, capitalists. It really is the way to stay rich.
Keep everybody happy and healthy. Yeah.
Less burning downs of the buildings, perhaps. Okay, it's 4:57. Thank you, Jen, so much for shedding some light on a polarizing situation and some facts. And thank you for your good works in the
Thank
city
you.
and feeding people. We need to connect afterwards. My son Jacob works at a store in which the person who used to pick up the food that was about to be thrown in the garbage stopped picking up the food.
Well, Rob, you get in touch because I will have somebody there. Thank you.
I know we can fix this right away. I just heard about it, and unfortunately the priest that was doing it doesn't do it anymore. I hope he's okay.
Yeah.
But let's fix that. We'll keep fixing things one at a time. Some of the things that seem like wicked problems that we cannot solve, some days you can solve
We can
something
solve.
small.
Yes, we can. Thank you so
Good.
much for the opportunity. And if anybody has any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for sharing the links with us later on. And I'm going to stop the video, and then I'm going to hand things over to Gord while I do this, and he'll get us going. And we've got, oh boy, Gord, we've got both the baritones here.
Yeah, deep baritones.